Hi, folks. This is Bob Walter. I'm the president of the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Join me Friday on Eddie's podcast when we can unpack a little bit about what's the mystery of myth.
Do something that matters. Do something that matters. Welcome to the Eddie Podcast. Welcome to Eddie Podcast. Welcome to the Eddie Podcast. Welcome to the Eddie Podcast.
Good morning and welcome to Eddie's Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, the founder and president of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, Robert Walter. Bob, nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Eddie. How are you feeling?
I am doing great, and thank you so much for being a part of this show and a guest on today to talk about Joseph Campbell and his legacy. We are super excited and ready to go.
Well, that's it. Before I start talking about Joseph Campbell and his legacy, do you mind if I kind of turn the tables here and ask you to begin by telling your listeners and me a little bit about the impact of Joseph Campbell on your life and why you sort of decided to ring me up and ask me to be on your podcast?
Well, Bob, that's a good question. I had a transformative moment in my youth because of Joseph Campbell. I had a traumatic childhood that kind of ended when my mother passed away unexpectedly when I was 15 years old. By happenstance, 2 months later in humanities class, Dr. Hernandez played The Power of Myth, which was the PBS miniseries where Bill Moyers interviews Joseph Campbell. That turned on a light bulb in my head, and prior to that moment, I was a C, D, and F student in school. After that moment, I never got anything but an A through the rest of high school, college, and law school. So having that knowledge that we're going to talk about certainly was transformative from where I could have turned out to be what they call a bad outcome to making the decision very early on to follow my bliss and go on that path of adventure and evolving on every adventure I take. So his work has been probably the most important philosophy that I've applied to my life. And you have had the opportunity to work with him for 15 years and have been curating his work since 1987.
Well, yeah, that's true. And your point of entry, The Power of Myth, is a common doorway into Campbell's work for a lot of people, as is that maxim that he unpacks in that show where he says about follow your bliss. Again, before launching into my story, how did that motivate you? What was it that about that idea of following your bliss that changed the trajectory of your adventure?
I think I was looking for guidance, and I was looking for something like an instruction manual because I didn't know how all these controls worked. I was 15 and I had a very sheltered experience, and then suddenly all of those safety nets were taken away. And the timing of my coming into the Joseph Campbell universe and this act, I consider that almost to be divine, an act of a God giving me a sign that I was perfectly at the moment to accept, and look at the change that it caused in just one person, following that blueprint that Joe wrote down in his Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Well, let's talk about the Hero with a Thousand Faces for a moment and the sort of algorithm, if you will, that underlies it, and put that in the context of follow your bliss, because I mean, the fuller quotation of Joe's is, if you follow your bliss, doors will open for you where there were before only walls. So I think that's a point from which to begin to look at the hero's journey. And it's been used and misused and abused and reused and repurposed by all sorts of people who have elaborated on this idea in many different ways. But at its essence, there are three phases to this journey. But let me set the context. An individual is in an environment. Typically, in traditional things, we talk about a village environment. So they're in a quotidian, day-to-day life, and something isn't right. You know, something's rotten in the state of Denmark. Something makes them think that there's got to be something more than this. And you know, in traditional literature, those signs are all around the individual. The crops are withering, or the king is infertile, or youths are dying, or you know, there are tangible reflections of the individual's dis-ease. And from that, there is this idea of a call to adventure. Something, you know, the little bird sings in the tree, or in the fairy tale, the golden ball that you're playing catch with rolls into the forest. And the forest is the opposite of the village. The forest is dark, and it's unknown, and it's where all the terrible, horrible things exist, and also where, you know, magic exists. And so the individual hearing this call, if they follow it, move into the forest. Now, there's variations at this point in the story. You can refuse the call. You can say, oh, no, you know, let me have another cup of coffee. Let me have another martini. You know, it's not that bad here.
But if you refuse, there's usually a consequence.
Well, yes. I mean, among other things, you know, you will get the call over and over again. And you know, as some have said, you know, if the call is at beginning like a tickle of a feather, and you keep refusing it, eventually it's a sledgehammer, or it's a traumatic advice that chases you out of where you are, where your resistance is overcome. One way or another, though, the antidote to this dis-ease is to move away from it and to move into what Campbell would call the forest adventurous. And it's at this point that, you know, he goes to, in his explication, he'll turn to the Arthurian tradition, where it says, each night entered the forest where it was darkest and there was no path. Because to go into the forest on a path means you're really just following in somebody else's footsteps. It's not your own unique, special adventure. It'll take you somewhere, but it won't take you into the transformative second phase of the hero's journey, which is initiation.
The first phase is really a separation from the life that you know it, and you yes. have a call, and that brings you to phase two, which is this initiation.
Thank you for that clarification. Yes, I failed to enunciate separation, but that is what happens. You step away from your prior existence and into a different realm. And that's where initiation occurs. And initiation is just a very complex series of events that are typically unique to that individual on that particular hero's journey. Because it's not like you have one in your entire life and it's over. No, you know, it's not one adventure. You know, Campbell likes to say that the perfectly fulfilled life is a series of adventures, a series of hero's journeys, which you undertake willingly, knowing that sometimes it's going to have a good outcome and sometimes it won't. But you don't know that when you enter into that dark forest. You don't know if you're going to meet demons and dragons and evil spirits and enemies that come to try to slay you, or if you're going to meet teachers and wise people and, you know, your own personal Yoda, if you will, or Gandalf.
And if you have a bad experience, there's usually a lesson to be learned. Yes,
and ultimately it seems bad in the moment, but it serves a purpose. You know, my father was a metallurgical engineer, and we didn't see eye to eye on very much, and I didn't really understand what he did. and what his trade was. He was he heat treated steel, and as I came to later see it, they would heat the steel and plunge it into cold and add chemicals and things to temper the steel so that the steel could be made into tools that could then in turn impact other steel. And so, it was much later on, when I started into this whole other area and started looking at alchemy on the one hand, but also just on plain metallurgy and how do you temper, how did we temper a sword so it didn't break? You plunged it into heat and heated it, and then you plunged it into cold. And there was this fine line between the steel shattering and coming up with the optimal sword or the optimal implement. And so that's the kind of process that the individual, the hero, goes through in this initiation. And it's not purposeless. It may seem purposeless at times. It may seem futile at times. It may seem like there's, never going to be another dawn. But in most of these stories, typically what happens is at some point through some series of actions, the hero is rewarded with what we call the boon, with an insight, if you will. It's not, in our theory of material, it's the grail. In some legends, it's the pearl or the jewel that the dragon is holding. In some other stories, it's the treasure that's hidden in the cave. But these, again, are all metaphors, ultimately metaphors for an insight. So the best example I can give would come from the oldest myth that we know, which is the story of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh sets out from his village, from his kingdom, to find the elixir of eternal life. And like in all these stories, he has encounters and good things happen and bad things happen. Ultimately, he gets the elixir, he finds it. And he's about to embark on the third phase of the journey, which is return, going back. But on his way back, he's been out in the woods for a long time, and he's been on this adventure, and he's kind of a sweaty mess. And so he comes upon a lake, and he puts down the elixir, and he goes into the lake to bathe. While he's bathing, the serpent comes along. This serpent swallows the elixir, slithers off into the forest. When Gilgamesh comes out of the lake, there's no elixir. Now, the telling thing here is that, he could have just said, oh shit, it didn't work. I found it, I lost it, woe is me. And I'm still going to have to go back, because you can't live forever in that altered reality. You ultimately have to end or complete that cycle by returning. And so he does go back. And as it says in the text that's come down to us, he went back without the elixir, but with a story. And
so that experience becomes the boon.
That's correct. And it's encoded in the story. It's encoded in the tale of the hero's adventure, which in its telling should enliven and enlighten others. And in traditional narrative, suddenly the grass is growing again, the king is fertile, everybody's happy in the kingdom. And so the journey's not complete, the adventure's not complete unless you bring it back home. But what you bring back home is not necessarily a thing. Okay, it's not as my friend David Miller calls it, it's not a widget. But it's an encapsulation of the story. And it's important to talk about this for a minute too, because the story has no value if it's not shared. And it may mean that you sit down and you actually tell the story. It also may mean that you come back and you paint a grand painting that shows what you saw. Or it may come back and the only thing you can do is sing or play your mandolin with a tune that embodies it. So the story, the experience, has to have some kind of manifestation. And it's actually at this point where Campbell will say, the myths of tomorrow are in the psyches of artists of today, meaning the adventures that are going to call someone tomorrow onto this hero's adventure are in your psyche. You don't know what they are. You don't know what you're going to encounter in that forest until you get out there, until you actually undergo the experience. And then when you do, the obligation is to bring it back. And again, history is full of of stories of people who come back with what are for them are very meaningful experience, and for most of the people in the village, they can't comprehend it. Perhaps that person has not rendered it in a form that's communicable. They become the babbling village idiot. Or the Christian tradition, you get hung up on a cross. I mean, there's that wonderful moment in the Bible where Christ is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he says, "Don't make me drink this chalice. Don't do it." What's he saying? He's saying, "Don't make me follow my bliss. Don't make me do what I need to do." Because this follow your bliss is setting you up sometimes for some serious issues, some real challenges, some things that hurt. My friend Michael Mead says, Campbell got it sort of right. It's follow your bliss, but when you follow your bliss, you're actually following your blisters. You're going out there. And in the Gnostic Gospels, they talk about Christ and his apostles going to the cross, singing and dancing, because it was what he had to do. It was what he could not avoid. So what you can't avoid is that adventure that is uniquely yours. You can stay in the village, pull the covers over your head, have another drink, do whatever. But ultimately, the key to living a fulfilled life is going on the adventure. And Campbell talks about the fact that the saddest testament is the person who spent their life climbing a ladder, gets to the top and discovers it's against the wrong wall, meaning they never got off of that ladder. They never actually abandoned that predestined track to go on to find their true adventure. So the hero's journey is separation, initiation, return. There's all kinds of elaborations of each part of that story.
And that template was articulated by Campbell in his book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. And it's really based on stories that occurred before there was really mass communication. So these stories developed in different parts of the world, and they all had the same element, the same cycle, the same algorithm to it.
Right. They had the details differ, but the arc of the story is the same. Just as you can take it, and it's happened now in all kinds of ways. You can take almost any great book of literature that's endured, any major film, things like that. You can see how it has that arc. I mean, in Aristotelian terms, it has crisis, climax, denouement. It's an arc. So it's there in these tales, and the ones that have survived are the ones that, for whatever reason, have spoken most directly to the people for whom the story lives. I was struck by lots of people go, these stories and these fairy tales, and they're just so simplistic. Because if you strip away all of the adventures that happen in the initiation phase, it's a pretty simple story. You're here, you go there, something happens, you come back. But think for a minute, if you were today, we're in the COVID virus. If we were to try to take the experience of this era and translate it into something that would be instructive and revelatory and important for our children's children, you got to keep it simple. That old KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Or if you've ever played that childhood game of telephone where somebody whispers something in someone's ear and then they, whisper it to another person, and meanwhile life goes on around them, and by the time it gets to the end, it bears no resemblance to what it originally was. The more complex it is, the more likely it's going to be disturbed. A good example for me of that is when the tsunami went through Southeast Asia. Because many of these stories, you have an enemy, another you're fighting. But, when you have a 500-foot-long, 500-mile-long, 18-foot-high wall of water coming, who do you blame? You can't blame anyone. it's a phenomenon. It's awesome. But on one island, in Asia, no one died. It was probably the only place where the tsunami came through and no one died. And some researchers went out to try to find out why that was, why this island was unique. And what they heard over and over and over again from everyone is our grandmother's grandmother's grandmother always told us, when the sea runs away from you, run away from the sea. Now, you can't get much simpler than that. And you also can't get more baffling than that, because the sea doesn't run away from you. Not unless you've experienced a tsunami where suddenly the water retreats before it comes in and inundates you. And when the water retreats, it exposes the seabed. And in most places, people went out to see what was there. But on this island, when the water retreated, everyone went, holy cripe, the seas just run away from us. And they all went to the top of the mountain, and none of them died. So that's an example of where a lesson encoded in what we'd call a myth, because a myth is on another level a lie. The sea doesn't run away from you. Nonetheless, carried really, really important information encoded in such a way that it could be passed down generation to generation, so that when this natural phenomenon occurred, people reacted in a life-saving manner.
So these stories are there to help teach us, to remind us of ancient knowledge, and to kind of turn on our creative outlet, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would. Or another simple way to say it is they guide us on our soul's journey. Because ultimately human beings haven't changed that much in millennia. We still have the same kinds of fears, and we still are subject to fears, and we're still subject to terrors, and we're still subject to joys and experience. The stories that endure speak to the human psyche and the human experience, and that hasn't changed that much. Certainly in our lifetime.
I have been employing this algorithm since I was 15, and I never ever dreamed I would be doing what I'm doing now. I'm a divorce attorney, and I do high conflict litigation, and I never imagined that this would, as a child, I wanted to be an actor or a rock star. And I listened to Joe, and I just continued that algorithm. And each time I completed a cycle, my comfort zone expanded and expanded. Right. And it gave me abilities to do new things. It brought people into my life that would have never have come into my life. And those people assisted me on to the next path. And I never know where I'm going. I just know I'm hopefully going in the right direction.
Yeah, my friend, the late Harry Chapin, had a song called Circle, in which he said, all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the evening till the daylight comes around. And then it goes on to say, there's no straight lines made up my life, and all my roads have bends. There's no clear-cut beginnings and no clear-cut ends. And so far, no dead ends. And that really is the thing. I mean, we like to say, and it's true, there's no straight lines in nature. So why should there be straight paths in an individual's life,
So an ordeal is really nothing that should be cowered from. According to Joseph Campbell, you enter the forest and you attack it and you overcome it and you evolve.
Yes, but there's a little twist in there that's important to underline. You typically overcome it by surrendering to it. As you go in and all these experiences that are foreign and hostile, these dragons and all this other stuff, they're not in your comfort zone. And so your first thing to do is to sort of rail against them. You pull out your sword and try to make it go away, okay? But ultimately the insight comes when you lay the sword down, when you stop fighting. Because on a psychological level, all of these things, your experiences, are part of you. And so you're really warring against your own evolution and your own illumination. And once you don't, do that, once you surrender to your fate, if you will, suddenly, the fog clears, and only, you realize, hey, right here where I am is where I'm supposed to be, and look what's at my feet. And that's the insight that takes you back.
Bob, can you tell me how you met Joseph and started working with him?
And again, it's a series of serendipitous encounters. I believe as all great happenings in our lives are. You don't plan it. I knew his work. In the early 70s, I used The Hero with 1,000 Faces in the courses that I taught in the first year of California Institute of the Arts. I eventually met the president of Sarah Lawrence College through a couple of speaking engagements. He asked if I knew Joseph Campbell and his wife, Jean Erdman. I said, I don't know them. I know their work. And he said, well, when you come to New York, I'd like to have a dinner party and introduce you, because your rhetoric is pure Campbell, but your art form, as I understand it, is close to what Jean called total theater. I was doing multimedia ritual presentations, performances. And so I came to New York. I met them. I visited their Theater of the Open Eye. I periodically went up and volunteered while I was busily working in the Broadway theater. And then at a certain point, I decided that, like most people in the business, there's this thing about, if I say no to a job, I'm never going to get asked again. If I turn it down, it's never, that's it. And so I went from one thing to another, finding myself frequently in situations like, how did I get here? And so I stopped, but I was still in that environment, and I realized that I needed to get back to what I was trying to do, which was, what I thought I was doing, which is, I called it creating secular rituals as opposed to putting on shows. I ended up taking a job, or I applied a number of ways. I took a job as a producing director of the Little Theater of Savannah. Now, it was a small community theater in a golf club, converted golf clubhouse in Savannah. And they offered me a job. I accepted the job. It was a mandate was to turn this into a professional regional theater, to take it out to the greater Savannah community. And so, like, my wife and I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We started packing our things. About 5 days before we were supposed to take off, I got word that this golf clubhouse, the theater, had burnt down. Now, a wise man would say, oh, this is a sign. I was not that wise man. I was the person who could, do whatever had to be done. And in my mind, it was a kind of a blessing, because I was much more comfortable working in found space than in a traditional theater building. So I said, no problem. We'll do our first season wherever we can find space for the particular shows, and we'll just start a fundraising campaign and build a new theater. They said, okay, great. 2 days after that, like now 2 days before we're supposed to leave, my wife comes home and says, I just got offered a job. And I said, yeah, that's great. We're on our way out of town. You get a job offer. What is it? And she said, I was offered the position of executive director at the Theater of the Open Eye. And I went, wait a minute, that's Joe Campbell and Jean Erdman's theater. And she said, yes. And I said, Nola, you've got to take that. And so she accepted the job, and I went to Savannah. And the first season unfolded. We started a campaign. I put together a company drawn out of Atlanta, some from New York, local people. We did we laid out a full season. I brought in a one-person shows on a sort of what I call the star series, and Julie Harris in The Belle of Amherst, Henry Fonda, and Clarence Darrow, and then we put together a company which was primarily Black, to go out into the schools, because the schools in the Savannah area are primarily Black, the public schools. Midway through the season, early January, I believe it was, I went back to New York for two purposes. One, I was going to book my star series. The second, I was going to cast a core of actors out of New York, and also I timed it so that I would go back at the point that Nola, my wife, and Gene Erdman were mounting a new show of Gene's. So I was back for opening night. I'd set up these auditions and these, interviews, and then on opening night, we all went to the New York Athletic Club for a celebratory dinner. Now, we all was Joe Campbell and his wife Gene Erdman, Nola and I, and then at the table were two people I'd not met, Alfred Vandermark, the scion of a Dutch publishing firm, who was a publisher at McGraw-Hill, and his wife, Margaret Hoswell. And very quickly, the conversation stopped being about the show we'd just seen and became about a book that had emerged. Joseph Campbell had been working on with Fred for some 5 or 6 years at that point. Now, Fred had an office at McGraw-Hill, but he produced books through a small studio in Lucerne. So the book had been being built in Lucerne. It was called The Historical Atlas of World Mythology. At this point, it was a 1-volume work. And what emerged during dinner is that McGraw-Hill had told Fred to shut down the studio at once in Lucerne. So he had told everybody, it's over, and they all went away. And left behind were 5-6 years of work on this atlas. And the discussion was what to do with this material, because Fred had a single office at McGraw-Hill. Joe and Gene lived in a 2-room apartment in Greenwich Village where the bedroom had become Joe's study. They slept on a double bed in the living room, and set up a folding table when they had meals. Joe said, and Joe was about to leave for his annual spring tour to the West Coast. Joe said, we don't have room for it, Fred, and I'm not even going to be here. Fred said, well, I can't take it back. And they went back and around with, well, could we send it here? Or, would they hold it in Lucerne, and all this discussion? And I didn't think much of it, except it seemed like they were, in a difficult situation. And then like 2 days later, I got a phone call from a newspaper in Atlanta telling me I was in the newspaper in two articles, and asked me if I wanted good news or bad. And I said, good news first. And they said, well, the legislature has committed a bricks and mortar grant to the new theater, which was one of the first, if not the first, such contribution to the arts in Georgia. And the bad news was that the night before, after receiving news of this grant, a bare quorum of my board met and terminated my contract effective immediately. And I was
that helped the decision a little.
Well, I was gobsmacked. I mean, my first thing was, this is horrible. This is, I got this contract, and also it was becoming very clear that the people who had met were the small faction on the board that was the remainder of the operations that before I arrived. The bulk of the board were new to the adventure. They were like the head of the bank and the Chamber of Commerce and stuff. They were the ones who had the idea that they should make this theater a regional attraction, and they had overlooked the fact that there was this small cadre, all white, who had run this place forever. It was their sandbox, and my arrival had essentially taken it away from them. They were still on the board, although all these people who had worked before, none of them were available to do anything. And so first opportunity, that happened. And after talking with my lawyer, who's the lawyer who's portrayed in the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, and was a good friend, and he was willing to, we were going to sue, and I said, I just need to, think about it. And it was, and then that weekend, 2 days or 3 days later, Joe Campbell was giving a lecture at the Open Eye. He was doing that at this point periodically. It was a fundraiser as much as anything for the theater, and I went down as I had done in the past when I was available, and I was their technician. Helped set up the lights and run the slide projectors and things like this. And then on the Saturday, it would go Friday night all day, Saturday, and then Sunday morning. He was indefatigable. On Saturday, at lunchtime, he and I retreated so that he would have a break from the questions and things coming at him. And over cheese, bacon cheeseburgers and Molson Ale. That was our lunch of choice for years. I said to him, look, I've been thinking about the dinner and your situation with your book, and my situation's changed radically in the last few days. So, you know, we have a 2-bedroom apartment. If you want to send it to the material to me, I'll be custodian of it and do whatever I can, make sure it's intact while you're on your lecture tour, and then when you get back, you and Fred can take this material and, you know, go make your book, because it was pretty clear to me that Fred had a high profile as a publisher, and Joe was a much published author, though he hadn't published anything in 8 years at that point. And I thought, okay, this is just how it'll happen. And he said, that's a really great offer. Thank you. That's a kind offer. Come on down to the apartment on Monday and let's talk about it. And I went down that Monday, and you know, we had a wonderful morning. We went through his library. He pulled books off the shelf. He said, you know, talked about them. And then we went out for our lunch, bacon cheeseburger, Molson Ale. And I came back and worked in the afternoon. And then around 5, we stopped and we went up to the Open Eye to meet the ladies. And we went our separate ways. And this went on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. And finally on Thursday morning, I said, Joe, this has just been great. It's been a wonderful time, but I'm not really sure, you know, I just offered to receive this material, you know, and try to, you know, keep it in order or whatever. And I'm not sure what all the rest of this is about. And he said, well, if you're going to get this material and you're going to work with me, I kind of feel like you need to know what's where and why it's organized a certain way. And then he digressed into saying, you know, when I edited the posthum of Heinrich Zimmer, I often wished that I'd had the opportunity to do with him what you and I have been doing, so that I had a clearer sense. And he said all I was left to do was ask these rhetorical questions and trust that I would uncover on my own the answer to the question. And I said, oh, okay. So, and he said, so are you going to do it? And I said, yeah, you know, I've said, send the stuff. And he said, well, let's go tell Fred. And again, at this point, I think I'm just receiving this material. I don't know what it is. I mean, it turned out to be lots of boxes in 3 languages and a whole bunch of stuff. But Joe says, let's go tell Fred. And I said, okay. And so we got on the subway. We went up to McGraw-Hill. I went up to Fred's office, went in the office, and Joe said, problem is solved, Fred. And Fred said, what? And he said, well, you know, I'm the writer. I'm going to keep writing. You're the publisher. You're going to keep publishing. Bob's going to be the editor. Send him all the material. And of course, I'm thinking, Bob's going to be the editor? That wasn't sort of what I thought I signed up to do. And then as we're leaving the office, Joe says, oh, and by the way, Fred, you're going to pay him. And we went back on, we were together Friday morning. Monday morning, Joe left for 3 months or 2.5 months. And in the middle of all this, the material arrived. I started, you know, trying to make sense of it. And he came back, and you're like a month and a half later, Fred got fired by McGraw-Hill. And then Joe said, I'm not going to write another word. And he returned the advance to McGraw-Hill. But he didn't actually stop writing. He kept writing, and I kept trying to be the editor, and we hired various designers, and Fred went out as the publisher with this major work and tried to get another job, and nobody hired him. And so then we decided at a certain point we went to like a second year. We went to by this time we mortgaged our houses, put the money in, you know, to keep the venture going. I was just a minor participant, and Joe went to the Century Club for a holiday lunch, and Joe said, "Fred, it's pretty obvious we have to do this ourselves." And Fred said, "What do you mean?" He said, let's start a publishing company. And Fred said, "You can't start a publishing company with one book." Joe said, "Oh, no. There's dozens of books that should be written and published. Bob and I will make the list." And within about 3 months, we had a publishing company. Still only one book, but feelers out to other people about other books we might publish, a list of books of Joe's that we should publish. And Fred started making the rounds again, saying, we have this publishing house. He was looking for a publisher who would distribute us. And nobody was interested. And this went on for another 18 months. Meanwhile, we're working on this book. We're getting more and more in debt. It's gone from being 1 volume to 2 volumes at this point. There's really no end in sight. We've got the first volume now just about ready to go, and we got a phone call from Harper San Francisco saying, "We'd like to take you on as a client publisher." And this was a big surprise because we've been turned down 2-3 times by that point by Harper and Row. And the folk we said, and Fred said this, and the publisher in San Francisco said, "Well, we're Harper San Francisco. We're not Harper and Row." Harper San Francisco was a division that was distributed by Harper and Row. So then we started into this position where we produced a book in New York. We had to ship it all, many months ahead of schedule to San Francisco so they could incorporate it in what they then were going to publish and ship it back to New York. And that's how it went. We went from nothing to approximately $4 million in annual revenue in about 5 years. And I found myself as chief operating officer and editorial director of the Atlas and of this publishing company, where we published books in art, photography, and cultural history. We said books that are timely and timeless. That's how it happened. And it ran along just really super until, we released the first volume. We were well into the second. We had a list. It was our 5th year. And then out of nowhere, Fred Vandermark's wife died. And then 5 days later, Joe died. And, Fred was, nothing mattered to him at all. And long story short, slowly, these conversations that Joe had with Bill Moyers, which we didn't know what we were going to do about, found their form as The Power of Myth. And that was aired. Joe died in October '87. In June of '88, Power of Myth started to air, and it slowly rolled out. Only three stations took it in first.
I remember I saw it on PBS.
Yep. It was originally 3 PBS channels. When the folks at PBS heard that this is what Moyers are going to do, it was like they said, their whole thing had been, we're looking for a younger audience, and you're going to do 6 hours of interviews with an 80-year-old mythologist. Well, that's really sexy TV. And so the result was, as I recall, that only a few channels picked it up in the first week. But then there was a buzz, and by the second week, a few more signed on. And so it had what we now think of as a graduated rollout, with more and more people, more and more stations in parts of the country picking it up. And it became a phenomenon. About the third episode, the third week, I knew something was happening because I wandered down Broadway, and there was a table that had been pulled out in front of Barnes and Noble. And there was this hand-lettered sign that said Mythology. And on this table was, anthropology, archaeology, comparative literature, philosophy, Native American folk tales, fairy tales, anything they could find that they thought might have something to do with mythology. And at the same time, I had tried, when I was winding down the publishing company, I tried to sell a 50% interest in this atlas so that we could publish it. By this time, we were publishing it in parts. No one was interested. I made the rounds at all the major houses. Everybody was, nice and kind. By this time, I I knew them all because I was now, this executive in publishing, and nobody was interested. And about the second or third week of Power of Myth, my phone started ringing, and these same people came back, and I think I was offering a 50% interest in this work. We were like $750,000 in debt at that point on this book, and I was and I just had this feeling that the Moyers thing was gonna hit, and we were publishing in Yugoslavia because it was the best, cheapest. So I knew, we were publishing a small amount of reprints of the first edition, and we were publishing the beginning of the second volume, and I knew that if this took off, there was no way we could reprint in time to feed the demand. So I was offering a 50% interest in this project for, I think it was $20,000, $25,000, which was just enough for me to up my print run in Yugoslavia. Nobody was interested. Ultimately, we sold it to Harper and Row, irony of ironies, for essentially $750,000, enough money to basically pay off our debt, with the agreement that I would complete these parts. So I spent about the next 18 months in this windowless room at Harper in New York, completing those sections, and we rolled them out. But it was again, the whole thing, the whole series, from my meeting Joe to how this publishing adventure happened, to the publishing company, to the Power of Myth itself. I mean, that was not planned. They had Bill and Joe had a conversation on Bill Moyer's journal in the early part of the 80s, and they'd received more requests for transcripts than they ever had, and so I won't go into the detail, but it just seemed to us that it made sense for them to get together again. Bill wasn't interested. Joe wasn't interested. They weren't interested, and Bill was at CBS at that point. And there's some discussion, would he come back to PBS? But what we finally managed to do is get them to agree that when Joe came from Hawaii to California, Bill would go out. We spoke to George Lucas. George said we could use Skywalker Ranch. And then there was a third party, Alvin Perlmutter and his wife, Joan Connor. They agreed to supply the cameras and the technicians and so on. And it was just sit down and talk, guys. Just have conversations. And they did that 3 times. And then they did one final set of conversations about 4 months before Joe died at the American Museum of Natural History. And then Joe died. Bill took a production fund that he'd been given by Corporation for Public Broadcast and decided to turn this into what became Power of Myth. So I mean, none of this was planned. It was just simply sort of following that golden ball wherever it bounced.
It sounds like its own hero's journey.
It was very much it was certainly a shot in the dark. I mean, the return was marvelous. But believe me, there were many times along the way. There's a point at which, and this is telling also because it speaks to who Joe Campbell was. Over one of our bacon cheeseburger and Molson lunches, in the middle of us trying, we'd started the publishing company. Nobody was interested. It just felt like we were going around in circles, and we kept going. And I asked him over lunch if he ever got discouraged, and he said, "I'm human. Of course I get discouraged. Well, why are you asking me this?" And I said, "Well, because I'm pretty damn discouraged right now." And he said, "That's understandable." And I said, "So how do you deal with this?" And he said, "I just tell myself that if what I'm doing, the work I'm doing, positively impacts one individual, it will have been worth it." And I thought, oh yeah, well that's easy to say, but I'm worried about how we're going to pay the bills next month, and how we're. I just said, yeah, okay, all right, okay. But that is how he proceeded. I mean, how else would you undertake a multi-volume work on your own at the age of 80, 78, he started at probably mid 70s, probably close to the age I am. But, he was just going, none of the chips were falling away that one hoped they would. But he persevered because it was the work.
And after he passed away in 1987, how did the JCF come into being?
Well, during the time that we were doing the publishing company, I still, I had this list of books that Joe and I had come up with, including a number of titles drawn from his work. And it was pretty clear to me that we would be really, really lucky if we managed to finish the Atlas, because it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then there were all these other things. And so I said to him one day, I said, Joe, have you given any thought at all to what you'd like to see happen with all these things that you haven't published? If you're not with us, what should we do? Where do we go? I said, I'm on top of. I hope I'm on top of the Atlas, but there's all this other stuff, and there were, there were manuscripts in his study that I knew about, others didn't know about, and he said, and I said, he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, have you thought about who's going to be responsible for them, or what's going to happen to them, or where do you want your papers to go, or things like this? And he said, doesn't matter. And he says, no, but nobody's really that interested. And I said, well, it's kind of a lot of stuff here, and I don't really think you want to just leave it to Jean. She had her own. She was still dancing. She had her own career. They worked and collaborated on some stuff, but to me it was like there's all this material. And he said, sort of que sera, sera. What'll be, will be. And then, in the wake of his posthumous celebrity, Jean and I both had, series of people, writing us, showing up at the door, wanting to see where Joseph Campbell had lived, talking about how the power of myth had changed their life, just wanting to meet her, wanting to ask me what else was Campbell's was going to come out. And it became real apparent. I mean, aside from the fact that Jean was, still deeply in bereavement, and there was also all these, metaphorically, all these vultures, from circling the corpus, so that things that, anything Joe had done earlier in his life was suddenly surfaced and being circulated as a, he gave this talk. We want, it suddenly was appearing, or somebody was going to turn it into a book or whatever, and it kind of became pretty clear. And I was his literary executor, I learned at that point, and so I needed to do something with this, I felt. But I also thought that this was not anything that could be handled individually, either by Jean or by me. And so I then said, Jean, we really need to talk about what to do. And I said, back in 85, 86, I asked Joe, if he'd made any arrangements or anything, and he said no, he hadn't. And I said, it's after the fact, but I think we need to do something. And she said, well, yeah, he said I do recall him telling me about the conversation that you had. And she said, so what do you suggest? And I said, I don't really know, but let me think about it. Let me ask a few people. And I talked to several folks, and then she talked to the folks who had handled his will, a law firm in Hawaii. And out of that, we decided the best thing to do was to start a not-for-profit organization and to deliver Joe's copyrights and unpublished materials to this foundation to be custodian. And again, we didn't really know what that meant or where it was going to be or how it was going to go. But that's how it happened. So in 1990, we incorporated the foundation, and it was under the radar through the end of 90 and most of 91 and into 92. And then in 92, we went public, and we sponsored a big fundraising event at the Smithsonian as a benefit for the then unopened Museum of the American Indian. And we brought together different people from different parts of Joe's life. The person who was the head of the Foreign Service Agency for whom Joe had lectured, and Bill Moyers and George was there, and we announced the foundation publicly. And we, at the same time, we announced an agreement to publish the collected works at that point with Harper and Row. It eventually, Harper and Row became HarperCollins and had become HarperCollins, and their mandate shifted, and that contract fell away. And we subsequently later, I think 93-ish, 94, we struck the deal with New World Library to do the collected print works. So it was and meanwhile, through all of this, of course, Campbell's celebrity was growing, and the foundation had members for a while, and it had people offering to do things. What it never had was a building. We never had buildings. We've never had employees. We've been a virtual organization since our inception. My joke with Jean is, she said, well, if we do this thing, will you run it? And I said, well, I'll run it with you, as long as we don't have to manage bricks and mortar. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, I've seen too many nonprofits fall on their face because they had to deal with paying the rent and things like that. And I said, and quite frankly, I don't have an edifice complex. And we had a good laugh over that one, and we decided that, okay, we would not have offices, we would not have employees, we would just do what we could do in a very in what we call now a virtual way.
And isn't it true JCF.org was one of the first websites on the internet?
Yeah, I've heard different numbers, but we went live in 1995, and I understand we were one of the first 500 websites out there. I know that if you go on the Wayback Machine, you can find our earliest iterations dating to early 95. And we were actually operating a website in a prototype sort of in-house for about 7 months before we pulled the plug and put it out in the world. So yeah, that became the basis for, in a sense, that became our central headquarters. That became the nexus for all the different things we've done.
And now what does the Joseph Campbell Foundation provide for people who are interested in learning about Joe's teachings?
Well, the first thing that we've done is we have a mandate, a three-part mandate that's existed from our beginning. And the first is to preserve, protect, and perpetuate the work of Joseph Campbell. So toward that end, we've cataloged and archived his materials. His papers are now at the New York Public Library. We brought into print all those books that were on that list once upon a time. We gathered early on all the various audio recordings we could find, and we began to catalog those and digitize those. That's a process that's gone on for a couple of decades. We have the collected audio now. And Bob, nearing completion.
Bob, that's one of my favorite pieces is being able to listen to all of these old lectures that Joe gave in the 60s. And you could really hear the excitement of the students. And Joe was such a good storyteller, and he had a verbal cadence that was just kind of hypnotizing.
Yeah, it's true. What we did there is we decided to release it in 3 series, the early lectures, middle lectures, and later lectures. But it's not all of them. I mean, we went through and some things we set aside because the technology at the time was not sufficient to bring it up to listenable standards. But we also decided that we just didn't want to put them out willy-nilly. So we created volumes where we brought together, in the beginning it was five lectures, and they were all 1 hour long. And that was because it was the age of cassettes. And our our distribution deal, they could fit 5 cassettes in a case, and a cassette was 30 minutes to a side. So you had to pick something where 30 minutes in, there was a logical break where you could turn the cassette. So that also affected what we chose. And then as we moved through CDs and we moved through pure digital, we were able to open up the length and the duration and what we put together. But we still left a lot of, there were still a lot of things we passed over for various reasons. So they're either redundant or they didn't fit in these volumes or other things. And so apropos what we're doing, or we're just in the process now of launching a podcast network, which should go live within a month or two. And we're going to repurpose some of the lectures that we that we passed over as Joe Talks, and so we're putting them with an interlocutor top and bottom, and we'll release those on our own channel of the podcast network. But we'll also be bringing together others who are working in the field and doing their own podcasts, and that actually leads us to the second purpose, which is to further Joseph Campbell's work, small w, which is cross-cultural communication, comparative religion, comparative mythology. Toward that end, we were instrumental in starting the graduate program in mythological studies at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Now there's 100+ PhDs in mythology out in the world, and we're blessed to be able to draw upon them and their insights of new generations to support these activities. And the podcast network is just one example of that. We also do a weekly email, and it's up on our website, which includes a myth blast, which is a short little essay about some mythological topic that has relevance to that time. There's also Campbell audio clips and video clips and mythological resources. But this is another way where we can use Campbell's, enable people to take a deeper dive into Campbell, and at the same time bring in these other voices from the next generation. People who've been working the material the last 20 years. And so that's in a sense our service to the field. And then our third purpose is to enable people to enrich their lives through engagement with mythological materials. In that area, up until for quite a while, we really worked with other organizations. So when the Parliament of the World's Religions came back, 100 years after its initial inception, we got involved in supporting their efforts and their programming. And similarly with the United Religions Initiative and with other activities. We've also have an ongoing program called Mythological Roundtables, which are self-organizing, self-directing groups in, I think we're on 4 continents at this point. There's about 40 or 50 that remain active. There's been dozens that have been there for a while and then folded, and some have come back. So these are chances for people to meet locally. And also in that area, back in the 90s, we started our Conversations of the Higher Order, which were online forums, back when there was no place else for people to have meaningful conversations online. When Facebook and other outlets came along, we archived that and froze it. But now we realize that that again, there's a real need for people to have meaningful conversations, not worry about their data getting usurped, not worry about getting spammed or things like this. And so we've started the Conversations of the Higher Order back up again. And so those are it. It's Campbell's work primarily, and what's come out of that we call the seed corn. The rest of the activities going forward is how we repurpose this seed corn, bring it to fruition, if you will, with the new generation, provide a forum for those people to continue it. And this September will be our 30th anniversary. So it's a kind of a shifting time. we've been blessed to come upon a number of younger folks who've stepped forward into major volunteer roles, which gives me great hope that the institution will go on. And they're dynamic. But then the same thing has happened with the material. Back in the day when they pulled all that stuff out onto Barnes and Noble, nobody knew what all this is. Now mythology is a section in most bookstores, where there still are bookstores. But there's also, mythology's infused graphic novels and video games and cinema and TV shows.
When I was a kid, we had one book by Edith Hamilton called Mythology.
Yes. That's it. That's about what it was.
So we are experiencing something now that we never have, this COVID pandemic. And as our societies have evolved, we have been tribal. There has traditionally been one storyteller in the village who would be responsible for news and passing on knowledge. And we really had nothing in common other than this metaphoric expression. But now we do have something in common that we're dealing with. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that for a moment.
Well, in my optimistic moments, I think about the fact that COVID-19 presents us with something akin to that tsunami wall of water, meaning a common malady, a common enemy that we can't blame on anyone else, much as certain people try to call it the Chinese virus and things like that. Am I less, and if that's the case, then people all over the world, regardless of where they live, their socioeconomic condition, race, gender, any of those things, they're all impacted equally. Ironically, the elders are more impacted. And I say ironically because in traditional societies and historically until very recent times, it was the transmission of the knowledge in these stories that have come back from the hero's adventures that were transmitted from the elders to the youth. And you mentioned, the fire, the campfire, and in the village, the traditional village, to this day, when the hunters go out to hunt and the gatherers go out to gather, it's the elders who are left by the fire with the younger ones in the village. And the younger one's job is to, see to the well-being of the elder, but more importantly, to keep the communal fire going. And in the doing of this, the stories get transmitted. That link has been really challenged, with society too often considering its elders to be disposable. And with our youth culture, the virus is challenging that in another way too, because, what keeps many a grandparent or an elder, vigorously engaged is participating vicariously in the lives of their grandchildren and their youth. And that's a no-no now. So that the virus in that sense is dividing us, but even more importantly, at least here in the West, but not solely in the West, where you have the anti-vaxxers and you have, it's become this politicized, response, with people showing up, give me back my freedom, armed on the steps of the Michigan Capitol building. And so I guess, I don't know why this should surprise me that it's in a sense any different than most human experiences. On the one hand, the glass is half full. On the other hand, the glass is half empty. So it really becomes where you want to look. And I increasingly take an engineer's approach and say, we need a new glass. We need a new way of measuring the impact. But I do wake up hopeful that I know that this will bring together people who might otherwise not come together, and that there will be more of that connection than there will be of the politicized disconnection. If
people wanted more information, where would they go on the internet?
They would go to JCF for Joseph Campbell Foundation, jcf.org, and you'll find a lot of mythological resources. You'll find access to all kinds of Campbell's work. You'll find, if you sign up, you'll get these weekly myth blasts with little, jewels and food for thought. And you'll find yourself part of a community of shared interest.
Bob, last time I saw you in person, you asked me out for a meal, and I didn't want to impose, and I didn't go. But next time, I think I'm going to treat you to a bacon cheeseburger and a Molson.
There you go. There you go. Or another alternative, which might be an amusing note to end on here is, on a number of occasions in Joe's senior years, people would come up to him and they say, "Oh, Dr. Campbell," he wasn't a doctor, but Dr. Campbell, you're such a wise and enlightened man. Do you meditate? Do you have a spiritual practice? He said, "Well, I don't meditate, but my spiritual practice is underlining sentences in books." and that would take them back a little, and they'd say, "Well, do you have a special diet?" And he would say, "Absolutely. The Glenlivet and rare roast beef." Because a little bit, Joe was and remained a maverick and a bit of an iconoclast. Got himself in a lot of trouble for it. But there was a point, and this will be my last comment, where, there was a section in the atlas that he wrote, and I'll paraphrase it, but it was about the European invasion into the Americas. And this section began by him saying, and then like ghosts, the ships appeared on the horizon, and they sailed into the harbor, and the men stepped off and moved across the continent, leaving in their wake museums where once upon a time there had been living peoples. He said, and like a virus, the plague of Christian love moved across the continent, leaving in its wake. And I said, "Joe, you don't want to say that. You're going to get such trouble." And he said, "I spent 80 years of my life trying to say things the way I thought people would hear them, and I wouldn't get in trouble. And now I'm going to say what I goddamn well please."
Well, Bob, thank you so much for your time today and for curating such important knowledge. And it was a pleasure having this discussion with you.
Indeed, Eddie, and I look forward to the next time we can be together.
I am C-3PO, Human Cyborg Relations, and you are too late for that. Eddie's podcast is on, and it's time to listen to Jacquie discuss the Star Wars universe. The possibility of successfully navigating this intricate discussion is approximately 3,720 to 1. Oh dear, we're doomed.
And now we continue with this week's episode of the Jacquie segment. Jacquie, are you with us?
I am.
Jacquie, our discussion last week ended discussing Season 7, Episode 9 of the Clone Wars. Now it's time for Episode 10. With the show now fully overlapping with the movie Return of the Sith, this episode, The Phantom Apprentice, has plenty of Easter eggs and references to other parts of the saga. We pick up where we left off, Ahsoka trapped by Darth Maul in the underbelly of Mandalore.
She is standing there with her lightsabers drawn, and Darth Maul doesn't care. She's in full attack stance, and he is going round and round her, questioning her. All he wants to know is about Obi-Wan and Anakin. He's a little confused as to why Ahsoka has been put in his path. He really expected to see Obi-Wan and Anakin. That's what his plan had been all along. And he knows something is going on out in the world with Darth Sidious and the Force. He can read it in the Force. And I know that there's a variety of opinions out there as to what Maul knows about Order 66. I don't believe he knows Order 66 by name. I don't think he knows Sidious's plan. I think that he can read the Force, and this is my personal opinion. He can read the Force, and he knows things are a-stirring, things are going on. And as a result, he's trying to figure out how Ahsoka fits into this plan. You know, he was an apprentice, a Padawan, if you will, of Sidious. She was a Padawan of Anakin Skywalker, and he's trying to figure out if somehow the two of them are meant to make a connection.
As Rex comes to rescue Ahsoka from Maul, Maul disappears. After a futile chase, Ahsoka and Rex eventually lose Maul for the moment.
Ahsoka asks for Obi-Wan's help. He can't back her up because he is going to be on his way, per instructions from the Jedi Council, to kill General Grievous. She asks for Anakin's assistance. And before Obi-Wan will respond, Obi-Wan asks for a moment of privacy with Ahsoka. Then Obi-Wan tells Ahsoka, well, the Jedi Council sent him to spy on the Chancellor. Ahsoka is really stunned because she immediately grasps the levels of political intricacy involved here, as well as the personal intricacies that, Palpatine had very much been Anakin's mentor since he was a very small boy. Anakin had a lot of respect for him. So she was kind of stunned that this happened. And then Obi-Wan said, yeah, Anakin's not really pleased about it. Perhaps you want to talk to him. Ahsoka is immediately just stunned. She can't believe that Obi-Wan has the cojones to ask her to speak to Anakin on behalf of the Jedi Council, asking the Jedi Council to have faith in them when, the Jedi Council didn't exactly have faith in Ahsoka when she was going through her trial and telling them she was innocent. So she is really not interested in having this discussion with Anakin.
And all during this whole time is where Palpatine has Anakin alone, swaying him to the dark side. And right before the conversation ends, Obi-Wan confesses to Ahsoka, the council isn't always right. That's why I'm asking for your help.
Imagine this conversation had actually taken place. Imagine that Ahsoka had the opportunity to speak to Anakin about what she knew from Maul before he really tipped over to the dark side. The conversation would have gone something like, Anakin, you're being manipulated by both sides. Maybe you need to take a step back and see what's going on here, see what your place in the Force really is. But as you and I both know, that was not going to happen. As Obi-Wan and Ahsoka are talking, Rex rushes in to tell them that there's been another battle breaking out and they think it's Maul. And the thing that's kind of sad is that as Ahsoka turns back to speak to Obi-Wan, we kind of realize this is the last time that we know of that they're going to see one another. This is another relationship that's been very long-standing. Ahsoka has known Obi-Wan since she was a very small child. And this is probably the last time that she's going to see him, although I truly hope that she pops up on his show, on the Obi-Wan TV show. That would be pretty cool if they could have a couple of episode adventure. But getting back to this episode, so Ahsoka leaves Obi-Wan and rushes down to see what's going on with this battle, and she just finds a bloodbath. I mean, Maul has just gone through the clones like a hot knife through butter. You would not know the clones had been highly trained warriors the way that he just... So she also she rushes to this one clone who's pretty badly beaten up, who apologizes and says, I'm sorry, we just really couldn't stop him. I've never seen anything like it. He just went through us so fast. and he took Jesse. And we know Jesse. Jesse's been in a lot of Clone War episodes. He's a very kind of cheerful, good-natured clone, heck of a warrior. And he's been taken by Maul so that Maul can read his mind to learn about Ahsoka Tano and to try to learn more about. Maul seems to know that what's going on involves the clones ending the Jedi line. So he wants to kind of scan Jesse's mind to see if he can learn more about Sidious's plot from him.
Meanwhile, Bo goes to question Almec. She gets right to the point when pew pew, a Mandalorian puts 2 bullets into Almec, and he's laying there dying, where he confesses this was all Maul's plan to lure who we find out is the real bait, not Obi-Wan Kenobi, but Anakin Skywalker.
This is where we really learn that Maul was not trying to get Obi-Wan here because he wanted his revenge for Maul, for Obi-Wan mutilating Maul. We think that this is revenge the whole time, but we learn that no, he understands Anakin's place in the Force, and he wanted him here to try to join forces with Maul. And I also thought that it was really cool that Maul has this, it's not even really a scene, it's a bite of a scene where he has a meeting with all of the crime syndicate bosses. You see little characters in there that you see from other movies. You see Dryden Voss from the Solo movie, and he tells them all to go into hiding. It's also interesting that when he then turns to speak to the Mandalorians, he says something about Mandalorians don't hide in gutters, because that's what the Mandalorians also said during The Mandalorian. They said something like, why does this guy get to go out and be a bounty hunter while we're all trapped in the gutters like rats? But back to the crime syndicate, during his time where he's trying to bring down Darth Sidious, Maul had amassed a great deal of power with these crime syndicates. He had formed a vast network of, people and weapons, and it was called the Shadow Collective, which included Black Sun, Crimson Dawn, the Pike Syndicate, and the group of Mandalorians that he was leading, led by Gar Saxon. Maul also comes to realize he had thought that he and Dooku had a much bigger place in Sidious's plans. He thought that they were more or less, I don't want to say partners, but something along those lines. And he came to realize through the course of this episode that he and Dooku were nothing but stepping stones, that they were not meant to be hand in hand with Sidious at this point in time, that they really just, were always one step behind Sidious. And he rallies the Mandalorians, led by Gar Saxon, those guys, to his side so that they'll step outside and support him. And then we see the Mandalorians and Darth Maul go out and get ready to fight the clones.
And this basically is the siege of Mandalore going down in the Clone Wars. And incredible Mandalorian fight scenes. You get to see all their toys, the fire, the shields, incredible fighting scenes. And when Ahsoka and Bo walk into the throne room, Maul is sitting there and takes total control. Bo fires on him. He deflects the fire and uses the Force to rendering her useless. Maul returns Jesse to Rex as a sign of good faith and leaves Ahsoka with Maul and Bo. Explosions are going on outside. Some of the coolest animation cinematography I've ever seen, where the glass explodes and in slow motion you see shards of glass with ambers of flame flying while Ahsoka and Maul have this conversation. And at the same time, Bo has this realization that the Mandalore has basically traded a dictator, Maul, for an occupation, the clones. And, it seems like she just wants to get everybody off her planet and take control. And I think it's very interesting because there's kind of a gap from that moment. And we pick up in the years later in the Mandalorian miniseries. And the Mandalorians are a much different race. For example, the primary difference is the importance of not taking off your helmet in the post-Mandalorian siege world. Do we really know what happens after the siege? Does the occupation end? The Mandalorians, how do they get from that point to where they are in the Mandalorian miniseries?
We don't know, and this is a question that's been coming up since they've made such a point in the Mandalorian TV show that he does not remove his helmet. Because we had seen in Rebels where the Mandalorians took off their helmets a lot. We had seen in Clone Wars where the Mandalorians freely removed their helmets. They were walking around Mandalore helmetless. So we don't know. We have a big gap in Mandalorian history. And I don't know at what point in the Star Wars universe and saga that they decided that Mandalore was going to have this much importance. But Mandalore has become, that whole plot has become it's taken on a life of its own. We don't know what the difference is, why whatever happened, that they are basically living in the sewers and they don't remove their helmets during the Mandalorian, whereas during Rebels and Clone Wars, they lived without their helmets very freely. And we're all very curious to find out. So as they're in the throne room, once all these explosions start happening outside, Bo needs to get outside and deal with the siege of Mandalore. So Bo-Katan leaves, Rex leaves, and Ahsoka and Maul are left to themselves. Maul really starts using the information he got from Jesse's brain to pick at Ahsoka. You left the Jedi Order. You were released from the Jedi Order. You were fired from the Jedi Order. No, I voluntarily left the Order. But you left the Order because of their hypocrisy. You left the Order because you discovered things were not what you thought they were in the Jedi Order. And she doesn't really want to talk about that. She doesn't really want to go back and deal with that. She just wants to capture Maul. So they fight a little, they talk a little, they fight a little, they talk a little. And Maul is getting more and more wound up. He notices that she is not grasping what he's telling her, that this momentous occasion, this big event is coming up. And she's not grasping that the Jedi are already gone, that the government is already gone, that law and order is already gone. She is still hanging on to the old ways, as Kylo Ren would have put it. And she doesn't understand that the time of the Jedi has passed and they cannot defeat Sidious, that Sidious has control. He's lived long in the shadows and now he's coming forth. The Jedi just cannot defeat Sidious.
And then Maul takes it one step too far. They start talking about Anakin Skywalker, and Maul says he is the key to everything. And Ahsoka asks why, because he's going to bring balance to the Force. And Maul tells her no, because he's been groomed to destroy everything. Maul responds, apparently the Padawan needs one last lesson. And this leads to one of the most epic lightsaber fights I have ever seen, live action or animated.
It's an amazing fight scene. It really is. And it brings us back to Empire Strikes Back. It brings us back to the battle between Darth Vader and Luke. You know, Darth Vader really didn't want to kill Luke. He wanted to bring him over to the dark side. And that's where we are with Ahsoka and Maul as well. Maul doesn't necessarily want to kill Ahsoka. We've seen throughout the Clone Wars, he likes being paired up. He was paired up with Sidious. He was paired up with his brother. He likes having a cohort. So he would have, and he could see Ahsoka's strength. I think that was very clear to him. So we have this really interesting parallel between the Empire Strikes Back fight scene between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and this epic battle between Ahsoka and Darth Maul. Now, in the climatic moment of this battle, Maul does disarm Ahsoka the same way that Vader disarms Luke. And it's the same sort of thing. Join me or die. But the episode does a really great job of subverting our expectations here as Ahsoka manages to fight back and capture Maul. She has kind of had the benefit of a lot more Jedi training than Luke Skywalker had at that point, to be honest. But she's able to escape Maul. They continue fighting here and there, and eventually she is able to capture Maul.
Right before Maul was captured, Gar Saxon requested backup, and Maul was like, later, or I think he says, die well, Mandalorian. So, you know, that kind of shows the high-level political manipulation, kind of what Palpatine orchestrated with Naboo, of creating these wars on these political crises that are really a hidden political agenda in disguise.
At one point during their fight in the throne room, Ahsoka says to Maul, okay, I'll join you, but you have to answer a question for me. And he says, you have but to ask. And she says, what do you want with Anakin? Maul's response is, he is the key to everything. Ahsoka says, to bring balance to the Force. Maul says, no. He has been groomed as Sidious's apprentice. So this is the part where you describe that Ahsoka kind of just can't process the information. It's been a lot of information that she's gotten. This was just what put her over the edge, and this is where they really continued the battle. And he also, Maul also tells Ahsoka at this point, you know, you don't see this, but I orchestrated the siege of Mandalore so that Obi-Wan and Anakin would show up. I manipulated all of this to try to get Anakin here, to get him on my side, but since it didn't work, here you are.
Well, actually, I thought Maul wanted Anakin to come so he could kill Sidious's prized possession, because he was kind of just discarded by Palpatine in his rise to power, similar to other characters like Dooku, who thought they had a more pivotal role, but really were just, like you said before, stepping stones.
I think that it shows how unstable Maul is, that he has a couple of different changes of heart. It seems that at one point he talks about Anakin, and he talks about, I wanted to bring him here because I wanted to kill Sidious's prized possession, his prized student. And then he says to Ahsoka, I wanted to bring him here so that we could join forces. So I think it just shows the instability of Maul.
Yeah, you do kind of see a deterioration, especially when he's talking to himself and questioning his actions. But it's interesting how they brought Ray Parker back to choreograph some of these animated moves. What did you think about that?
Ray Park and I wish I remembered the name of the female stunt woman because she did such a fabulous job. They did the live action and, the costumes with the dots and stuff. And I think you said it's probably one of the best lightsaber battles ever, period. End of story. Not animated, not live. It was just amazing. And the fact that both Maul and Ahsoka are, in my opinion, very athletic fighters. They don't stand still and fight. There's a lot of whirling and twirling. Maul is more martial arts. Ahsoka is more gymnastics. But they're just flying all over the place. She's got the double lightsabers. He's got the red lightsabers that are hooked together. It's just a phenomenal fight. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it goes, from place to place. They fight in the throne room. They fight outside. They fight on the supports that are holding buildings together.
Very reminiscent of the Anakin or Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, Empire Strikes Back battle.
Continues. Yeah, the comparisons there continue for sure. And when they make it outside, Ahsoka and Maul are fighting, and it seems like he's got her on the ropes. She's lost both of her lightsabers, and his ship is showing up to take him off. This is the point in time where he tells Gar Saxon, sorry, you're on your own. Die well, Mandalorian. But Rex has seen, because Rex and Ahsoka are they're so connected. Rex has seen from the ground what's going on up higher, and he gets the air forces up there to assist Ahsoka. So as Maul's plane is approaching, the clones have also approached, and Ahsoka and the clones are able to capture Darth Maul, who is being held there literally in the air by the clones' various, they've shot ropes out at him and nets and stuff. And let me die. We're all going to die. You're going to burn. I'm going to burn. We're all going to die. Let me go. And he's just really, really, really losing it at this point. And Rex says, we've got this. And Ahsoka just kind of goes, ah. There are two important things from the episode that I would like to point out. One of them is that at some point, Ahsoka just stops telling the clones, don't call me commander. I'm not a commander. At some point, she just stops and accepts it. She falls into that fighting mode with the clones, and, she just accepts that she's back where she was, even though she's not. If you've already seen the last couple of episodes, you know that it's important that it shows how much Ahsoka loves the clones. She is devoted to the clones. She is fully caught up in her leadership of the clones. It's really important to see the tenderness that she displays towards the clones, because Order 66 is coming, and some of the decisions she makes about the clones may surprise us.
And it's coming up in the next episode, and without giving any more away, we're going to save that discussion about episode 11 for next week. We have 2 more episodes of the Clone Wars to get through for season 7. Jacquie, I want to thank you for, again, joining me every week on my podcast to discuss and geek out on Star Wars. I love you.
It's a trap. It's a trap. It's a trap.
That's going to bring this edition of Eddie's podcast to a close. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, go to eddiepodcast.com. I'd like to thank my special guest, Bob Walter, president of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, for that great interview. I'd also like to thank Jacquie for her discussion of the Clone Wars. Join me next week where my guest will be these guys.
Hey, you. It's time to get off Facebook and stop arguing and watch something cool. So tune in Friday for the Ink Edition with me, Pooch, and
me, Scott.
For a really cool podcast with Scott White and Pooch from Altered State Tattoos, the Ink Edition. Hope to see you next week and do something that matters.
Yo, Eddie, got a story to tell. Positivity touch you, bet you feeling like Braille. There's something to that trauma, you've been through it. Something like closure, the promise to get through it. Sometimes it's nice to lean on somebody's shoulder, especially when that shoulder been there a couple times over. That intimacy navigates in empathy. Eddie's podcast, a journey, relax and take a seat. La da da do. Do something that matters. La da da do. Do something that matters. Welcome to the Eddie Podcast. Welcome to Eddie Podcast. Welcome to the Eddie Podcast. Welcome to the Eddie Podcast.
So another chapter ends, another book concludes, and another story has been told. Are we better for it? I'm afraid the answer to that has been lost for hundreds of years. Okay, nonetheless, be sure to join us next week for another edition of Eddie's Podcast. And subscribe, damn it. Go to www.eddiepodcast.com. Put it this way, if I could subscribe twice, I probably would. Lastly, I leave you with an age-old quote by the beard of Zeus. Go do something that matters. Stay classy. Stay safe.